because it's one of many things that have been noticed to pop up quite often in domestic animals. And there's a study that's actually been performed on those silver foxes that I showed you before in order to try to understand why it is that friendliness and all these other traits come up time and time again, and not just dogs like the bulldog, but all sorts of species. So things like having very large and very small forms, the piebald coat color, like I said, with the pigs, the spotting, the white and black, the hair quality, the tail, what it looks like, and how many vertebrae you have extending into it, all these sorts of things. And you see them in all or nearly all or many different domestic animals. And there was a researcher named Belyaev in Russia way back in the beginning part of the 20th century who said, it seems to me that a lot of these animals are animals that we're friendly with because they have to be tolerable at least so we can work with them, otherwise they're the ones we're going to slaughter first. And so here we have selected for these animals that are kind of nice, and we get all these other things. So is it because we're selecting for friendliness that we see all these other characteristics changing? And in order to study this, he took 30 males and 100 females of these foxes, and they bred them, but they only bred the ones that were friendly. So not the ones that were neutral towards humans, certainly not the ones that were aggressive. They almost never came into contact with these animals because they wanted to isolate the effects of genes and not environment. And sure enough, after just a very few generations, they found changes not only in behavior, which is what they were selecting for, but hormones, reproduction, they get spotty coats, they have floppy ears, they have different tails, they have shortened tails. So all of these things that I was showing you on that previous graph, here suddenly they are in these foxes, and they weren't even selecting for those. And they suspect that the reason for this is that the genes that are regulating behavior are genes that are regulatory. So they turn off and turn on certain things at different times. And so it just so happens that they're turning off and turning on things related to behavior, but they're also turning off and turning on things related to all these other things as well. And it's a really important process is ontogeny, so the development of things. And that's one of the examples here of floppy ears. Normally you see floppy ears in puppies, and then as they grow up, the ears perk up slowly. But what happens is that it turns off the genes that tell the ears to perk up. It keeps on the genes that keep them floppy. And so you have these floppy ears throughout adulthood. And all these other things, the kind of timing of them is messed up as well. So pets are probably involved quite closely in your lives, but actually another thing that a lot of you, I'm guessing, participate in is supplemental feeding in your backyard. And I thought Sasha was going to steal my thunder a little bit with his talk, but luckily he didn't go too far down the road of talking about black cats. And actually the migratory story that he mentioned, he was priming you all because I'm going to discuss it in a little bit more detail. So what he was alluding to is the fact that very recently these guys have been found to suddenly have 2 migratory paths instead of 1. And what used to happen is that they would all start off in Europe and go down to the southwest, and they would overwinter in Spain, why not? And they would eat olives and have a lovely time, and then come back and breed. But then people came along, people would say, hey, we have bird feeders. We have bird feeders in the summer, why not have bird feeders all the time? And so people leave out their bird feeders, and all of a sudden the black cats would linger, and some of the ones from Europe, they might have gotten lost, or they might have already been around, who knows, but they started coming to Britain. And so now all of a sudden we have these European birds that go to Britain, and we have European birds that go down to Spain. And when they're in Britain over the winter, they're probably not eating olives because there aren't too many to be found, but there are lots of bird feeders. And so what you see is that in places where you've got feeders, all of a sudden you have these phenotypes that are changing, the morphology is changing. So birds that are of the population that come to Britain, they have suddenly wings that are good for short-term flight, nice rounded shoulders. So they don't have to fly very far, but they can maneuver quite well. And they also have longer, narrower bills that are good for reaching into the feeders and getting little seeds and manipulating the seeds. Birds that go south, on the other hand, have the thinner wings that are good for long-term flight, consistent flight, And they have wider, fatter, shorter bills that are good for eating things like olives. And what researchers have found, this is actually a German team that studied these guys nesting in Germany, is that the birds that come over to Britain, they don't have to fly nearly as far as the birds that go down south. So they pop over, they pop back, they get to the breeding grounds earlier on, they start breeding with each other because, hey, they're all there, why not, let's get going. And then the southern guys come up and join them. They sometimes live in the very same place, but they've arrived a bit late, so they all breed with each other. So you have two very distinct things going on, and these guys almost never interbreed. And that's why you have these very distinct morphologies occurring, is because these guys are no longer breeding. And all of this can be traced back to this, and our behavior. And actually, there are other things that supplemental feeding do as well. There was another recent study that found that mother birds that have chicks, when they're incubating them and then when they're feeding them as young, they're spending a lot of their time eating out of these things. And then that gives them a certain sort of nutrient load that's different from what they would have gotten had they been eating stuff from nature. And the nutrient load affects how the chicks' brains develop, and that affects how the males go on to sing. And actually, it affects them negatively. And so young males that were raised in the environments where the moms are eating seed, don't sing as attractively as males that were having a natural diet. And this is probably going to impact female mate choice because they want males with really nice songs. And so here we are again having this example of how we can kind of go in and change things, and that is going to alter, sometimes not for the better, the way that things are going in the habitat. Which is not to say that you need to all take your bird feeders down. This hasn't really been studied fully, so no one knows that there are going to be negative implications, but there are certainly implications. And the last example I want to end on is maybe a bit depressing, but I think it's actually one of the most serious for us anyway. And that's what happens when we go in and apply chemical treatments. And that can be things like insecticides or other pesticides, fungicides, whatever, herbicides. But it can also be antibiotics. And so what you've got basically in any of these systems is you've got lots of different types of things, genotypes, gene variants. And then what happens is when you apply these things that kill them off, you kill off the weak ones, right? So you're killing off the ones that are susceptible to whatever it is you're applying, but then you're leaving the resistant ones that are hardy enough to survive it. And then the resistant ones breed, and they have more resistant ones if this is a hereditary thing. And all of a sudden you've got a population of things that are resistant. And that is not good if we're talking about diseases. This is gonorrhea, which recently, in the last couple of months, people have announced is not resistant just to one thing, but to almost all things. And healthcare officials are kind of in a furor now because they're not really sure how they're going to treat this. Keep going down this path. Because here we have this horrible thing that can cause lots of problems over the long term, and all of a sudden it's resistant to all the things we're throwing at it. And it's certainly not the only example. And this is particularly scary in things like bacteria because they do something that's known as lateral gene transfer or horizontal gene transfer. Basically, they just kind of spit out their genetic material into the environment. Another microbe comes along and sucks it up and can incorporate it into its genome, and then all of a sudden, whatever gene that other bacteria or microbe had, now it has it. So that's a great way for you to get resistance to all sorts of things, even if you've never actually been exposed to those things in the first place. And that's one of the reasons that we have things like gonorrhea, although